I'm going to have to put a warning at the start of this episode that anyone who normally runs should bring a pen and pencil with them as they go in there. Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time poor but enthusiasm rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Nick Pointer,
Hello.
and we're going to explore professional development, school improvement, maybe a mixture of both. But Nick, this is your first time on the podcast, so I was wondering if you could let everyone know where you're from and how you got here.
Yeah, thanks, Kieran. Um, my background in schools was originally trained as a secondary science teacher, working in a range of contexts in kind of London and the Southeast. And I ended up with a role as director of science in an all through academy. So we had primary and secondary on site all the way up to sixth form, which was quite a nice chance to see the kind of progression, particularly the science curriculum, all the way from kind of reception, kind of early years, all the way through to kind of post 16 provision. And I then left the classroom, and I think it's important to say, like I respect and recognise the work of kind of chalk-faced teachers, and say I'm an ex-teacher. I don't currently do that grind and that graft every day in the classroom with kids. But now I'd call myself a teacher educator. So I work at Ambition Institute during the day. I get to a range of exciting things, all kind of revolving around PD, professional development. So I help design and deliver our master's program. I lead a fellowship for those leading on teacher education in schools and trusts. But mainly, kind of what I do every day is get to think really hard about how we can best support schools with really high quality PD offers. And also that this closing the gap between some of the theoretical ideas that come out of the literature and those best practices, but also the practical implementation on the ground. How can we support schools and trusts to um, really kind of get it right with the limited time available they've got for teacher development? So part of my work involves going to schools and coaching teachers or supporting setting up coaching systems. And part of it involves helping the design and kind of roll out of our new programs.
I think you're almost the epitome of the deep thinking teacher slash ex teacher. Chris Such, to my shame, as I think he was working with you a couple of weeks and said you have to interview Nick. He thinks really carefully about education, and so it's my fault that we haven't done this much sooner. And he also said you've got a very sultry voice, and in terms of the podcast, that's my mo or my unique selling point. And so there may be times when I go full ASMR to counteract your smooth dulcet tones.
You're right. I'm going to come and take over your niche.
Makes sense to almost start with context. Your work revolves around supporting school leaders to think hard about teacher professional development. Have you seen a shift in the sector and how we approach CPD over the past few years?
Yeah, I think we have. Like, I think we're in an interesting position. I think a lot of my work comes out of the fact that I think there's a shift in the way the sector's thinking about the role of PD. So I'm going to say PD generally to mean professional development. I know often people would call it CPD in schools or teacher development or teacher professional learning. I essentially use PD as a kind of shorthand for all of those things, kind of any training or development of either beginner, trainee, or in-service teachers or school leaders. Um, I think it's been a shift. Like, I suppose going back to the start of my career when I was in my very first school, like CPD was something you'd be sent out to do. You'd be sent out, say, oh, go on this day course, this day CPD course. I remember traipsing down to, I think, Dulwich College actually, for a day of kind of physics intensive PD training. And that often was the norm, at least in the settings that I kind of revolved around the early stages of my career, was CPD wasn't something that really was often prioritized as part of the work of schools. It was, we're going to book you off and send you out on a course, often these day courses. And to be honest with you, not to sort of diminish the quality of those kind of provisions, and often they were really kind of interesting and insightful and like really big thinking happening. But I often found it quite hard to contextualize those courses in my practice, and I probably would say in the majority of cases, whether that's the fault of myself or the courses, I didn't make a massive change to what I did in the classroom at the back of them. But I think like recently there's been a shift to school leaders thinking much harder about their in-house offer for teacher development. And part of that might be like kind of budgets and things, and people thinking, well, actually, day courses are quite expensive. Surely we can do this ourselves. But I think there are like much wider benefits beside cost. You can contextualize that teacher development offer to the needs of your context, your teachers, your pupils, the area you work in, the needs of your staff. You can obviously fit it around the school schedule, so make it far more efficient than having staff off for a kind of whole day to traipse off to a course. But also, I think like one of the real benefits of this shift, which might be in part due, I think, to some of these golden thread programs, kind of the ECF and the reformed MPQs and the new and reformed MPQs. But I think one of the biggest benefits of this, and the thing that I'm seeing in the sector, is uh, like framing this work of teacher development as part of your daily life as a teacher, part of your kind of weekly routine and cadence of your work, like sort of frames ongoing teacher development as something that's kind of fundamental to part of your work as a teacher, having it embedded in the kind of day to day of school life, says, well, it's something we all do. And we're all constantly kind of striving to improve our practices, to improve our impact on young people. And I think there's something moral there, like the idea that uh, we can and should sort of constantly look to see where we can iterate and improve the offer we give to the young people we work with. I think there's kind of a moral duty to do that as a teacher. Like if we can improve, then I think we should, and I think everyone can improve, right? It's a lot of the ideas that we come across in like PD, whether we're talking about assessment practice or curriculum or teaching and learning, like might take like a minute to learn, but they probably take a lifetime to master. I don't think anybody over the course of their career would say they've kind of nailed teaching. I think it's infinitely complex. It's so difficult. Um, I suppose like out of that, something that like feeds into the work that I do and the thinking that I've been doing is there's this I think historically, going back to the start of my career, I think in my second year of teaching, I was made an NQT mentor, which was sort of bananas because I was an NQT myself and I was mentoring. No, I think I was mentoring a beginner teacher. So I was an NQT and I was mentoring a beginner teacher. But I was never sort of told how to mentor, what good teacher development looks like. And so all I did was essentially just copied what had been done to me, what I'd had as my kind of diet as a trainee. Um, and I think the thing that historically we haven't really recognized, and I think is increasingly being recognized, is like the body of knowledge and skill required to be a highly effective teacher educator, someone who develops other teachers, is probably kind of a like relatively distinct body of knowledge from being a really highly effective teacher. Now, there's probably some overlap, right? You probably need some of the stuff that it takes in terms of knowledge and skill of being a great teacher to be a great teacher educator, whether that's being a mentor, whether that's being a coach, whether that's being a leader of CPD across a school or across a trust. There's probably something there that you need to know and be able to be like a good teacher in the classroom. But I think there's some aspects of being a really highly effective teacher educator that's sort of distinct from being a great teacher. There's some stuff you might want to know and be able to do that you probably don't just pick up along the way in the classroom. And again, like historically, I think I certainly never had that provision as a mentor. I know it's increasingly kind of part of the conversation and part of the provision as part of the ECF. ECF mentors, there's starting to be recognition of saying, right, well, actually, we probably should give some training and support to the people working with our kind of most novice teachers. But a lot of the stuff I think about is, well, what is that stuff? What is that body of knowledge and skill that really great teacher educators who are going to have a massive impact on teacher learning and ultimately kind of pupils in their kind of setting look like? Like what stuff should we help teacher educators to learn and be able to do? Yeah, so that's what I spend a lot of time thinking about.
We've almost seen a lot of this journey unravel over the time of the podcast. So we started, I think, the January of 2021, and a lot of the things you mentioned were either in their infancy. Certainly, the approach to coaching and things weren't. The conversation wasn't really developed. Do you think there's a reasonable amount of schools who are engaging with this? I think the ECF and the MPQ numbers are reasonably healthy. Do you think there's a bubble, or is this something that's spreading across the English education system?
I'm really always really wary of the bubble effect. And I know that, like I say, my day-to-day work at Ambition, we obviously work with schools who are, highly engaged with our kind of ECF provision and our kind of MPQ provision. Um, and so I suppose whilst I'd like to think that this is a conversation that's happening across the sector, I'm trying to be wary of my kind of biases there and like particularly again, said earlier on, right, about this change or this shift in the sector towards the idea of PD being something that's done in-house. But on the other hand, my question is always, well, if you are a leader of teacher development, let's say you're a head of teaching and learning, or you're a kind of phase leader, or you're a coach, or you're a mentor, if you haven't had that kind of external input and that external provision, whether it's from being an ECF mentor, whether it's having some kind of external PD provisional support. Like my question is always, well, like where's that going to come from? So I suppose it's probably unsurprising that I think there are lots of kind of pockets and areas where this idea that PD is something that is done in house and that actually we should think really hard about in schools and that we should continue to try and develop really high levels of expertise in the way we sort of build and deliver that. I think it's probably unsurprising that um, lots of people just don't know where to start with a lot of that thinking, and they haven't got uh, the opportunity and the time to engage in, some quite impenetrable literature sometimes to dig into that stuff. I think the time is a big factor. I think it could be very easy for me to glibly say, you as a school leader, it's your responsibility to think really hard about um, what the best available bets are from the literature, whether that's about like the design and delivery of PD, or whether it's also about, effective teaching and learning. And then you should design and configure a really coherent and comprehensive teacher development offer to happen kind of alongside a teacher's working week and fit that into all the other kind of millions of things you have to kind of grapple with. I think it's pretty reasonable to come back and say, well, look, I'm kind of don't really have to start with this and I haven't really got the time um, to engage in a lot of that thinking. And it's not clear to me, like it hasn't, there's no one to explain or kind of to really break down um, like why this might be so important, but also just how to, again, like fit that into and join that up with everything else a school does.
Yeah, I think you're on the money. Quite often when with the best will in the world, firefighting can become the predominant and or the prevailing sort of mood in a school, and it is trying to find that space. But I hope that we are as a sector moving ever closer towards this idea because I love seeing the examples of people really thinking about professional development, thinking, "Wow, that yes, I wish I had that when I was younger," or I'm going to tell my friends who are head teachers about something that they're doing because. Like I said, as we trace this across the podcast, I've had a chance to speak to lots of really interesting people about what they do, and I really want every teacher to have access to that.
Yeah, I think there's some incredible work being done in some really like really cool, exciting PD done in lots of settings. And I suppose, yeah, for me the question is not only in my main body of thinking, how can I help distill some of this evidence and share the practical insights for school leaders and teachers, but also how can we kind of like highlight, spotlight, and kind of share some of those really great practices that are happening that they might not have kind of the exposure or a window into the sets so people can see what they're doing. Um, but yeah, it's really tough. And I always think accountability is a tough one as well. If you're a school leader, my one of my arguments I like to make is that I think teacher PD is your school improvement plan. The main way, the most sort of effective and efficient and also cost-effective way of improving schools is to improve the quality of the teachers standing in front of the kids every single day. But there are so many other pressures as a school leader, external accountability, um, internal accountability pressures, pressure from kind of governors, trustees, Ofsted pressure, um, that I think again it's quite unsurprising that um, this kind of quite maybe nebulous idea of like teacher learning or ongoing teacher professional development, um, like it isn't quite as grabbing, doesn't feel quite as immediate as the need to kind of put into place new policies or to try to move data forward. Um, and I suppose that's again one of the things I'm sort of trying to kind of ring the bell for around the sector is like if we could just think like that much harder about teacher professional learning, it's going to support all of those other kind of aspects of schooling that we want to continually look to develop.
I think the listeners know I love going to research ed. One of the best things about it is the chance to listen to really smart people share their views. And I think it was very start of March in Warrington, I was lucky enough to catch your session, and I thought it was fantastic. And you mentioned your preference for a mechanisms first approach to teacher professional development. What does this entail, and why not define PD by, for instance, form or characteristics?
It's a good question, Kieran. I mean, I'm gonna like try not to make this a 3 hour podcast because you've started me off on a question that I think I could talk about all day. Um, so I think like characteristics I want to start with because if you look back historically at the research, because I think we should be informed by the best bets from what literature suggests. If you look what the research says about effective PD, historically you've got reviews like Timperley et al., Desimone 2009, Cordingly et al. 2015. And these sort of looks to synthesize and bring together kind of the best available evidence about PD programs that worked and PD inputs that worked, like what makes great PD. And they kind of narrowed in on a kind of consensus of traits or characteristics or features of PD that made it tick. So it's things like PD should be sustained over time. PD should be collaborative. PD should be focused on teaching and learning content. It should draw on external expertise. You should have some active learning. I'm not sure what that means, but active learning to use or practice or apply what's learned. And like these all feel kind of relatively sensible and reasonable. But the problem is that a lot of these historical reviews are correlational. So they look at what PD programs were highly effective from research, and they say what features did they have, and then they draw this kind of consensus of those common features. But the problem is that as a scientist by background, a science teacher by background, you should be careful there. Correlation is not causation. The fact that these PD programs had these features didn't mean that that's what made them tick or made them effective. They could be present in all these programs, but causally redundant. They might not be the thing that leads to any impact. And the example I always give is, well, like collaborative. It looks like loads of the PD programs that run and that are effective are collaborative. Well, that might be true, but they might just all be collaborative because that's a really efficient and cost-effective way to design PD. Like it's much cheaper to design a PD program with one teacher educator standing at the front and then 30 or 60 teachers sitting in front of them than it is to have one-to-one PD. So often PD just gets designed in a way that's collaborative or large group settings in order to kind of reduce costs. And if all the PD programs or majority of them have been designed like that, then it sort of stands to reason that, yeah, like a bunch of the ones that are really effective will be collaborative, but possibly also a bunch of the ones that are ineffective will also be collaborative. It's just something that tends to happen in every PD program. So, like, I find it quite, I think it's quite risky to draw a conclusion from that we should make PD that's collaborative. It doesn't tell us whether it's a good or bad thing. So that's kind of characteristics. And I think, again, these characteristics of PD are like very descriptive, but they're not very informative. They can't tell us that these things are impactful. The other thing you mentioned, like forms, is another way of like trying to codify what makes great PD. And so a form of PD is like a label or a sticker, like a wrapper on like a package. So for example, you might talk about instructional coaching or teacher learning communities or lesson study. And those are kind of labels that wrap up a whole load of stuff that's happening with a big title and says, this is what we're labeling our PD with. Here, there's a kind of another problem, right? And it's called the jingle fallacy, which essentially refers to when you have two or more people using the same term to refer to things that are actually different under the surface. To give the example of, let's say, instructional coaching, when I say instructional coaching and someone else says instructional coaching, like how do we know we're thinking about exactly the same thing? And I almost guarantee that in majority of settings, if you ask people to say who would tell you they're doing instructional coaching to discuss and compare precisely how they've done that in their school, often there'd be maybe some small differences, maybe some big differences, right? So the risk of these forms or these labels is that they sort of suggest that they represent shared language, but the risk is that that shared language isn't actually shared, and they're labels that mean actually under the surface quite different things. So in 2021, the EEF set up a team to essentially um, explore like what we might be able to know about the aspects of PD that make it effective, and they put together a report into a guidance report into effective professional development. And in that, they sought to sort of unpick what might be called in medicine active ingredients. So in pharmaceutical companies, they will call the active ingredient of a product the thing that makes it work. So, for example, in the analogy often given is toothpaste. In toothpaste, you've got the characteristic. The toothpaste is kind of white and probably minty flavored, unless you're American, in which case it might be cinnamon flavored, which sounds awful. Um, the form is the package, and it's got a nice label on it with some pretty writing. Um, but the mechanism, the active ingredient, sorry, is sodium fluoride. And if you take out the sodium fluoride, the toothpaste is no longer any good at preventing cavities. Likewise, this team sought to really dig into the research and distill what are the active ingredients or what they've called mechanisms of teacher professional development. What are the things that cause it to have an impact upon not just teacher learning, but actually ultimate pupil learning? And that was a key aspect of the research. They didn't just look for teacher behavior change, they looked for impacts upon student outcomes. And they distilled down 14 of these mechanisms, which then become kind of causal and replicable and essential in PD, to say, here are the things that we believe from this kind of really rigorous exploration of the literature have a causal impact on, I said, ultimately kind of the outcomes for children. There's 14 of these. There's a whole variety of them, and people can go and look these up on the EF's website. But they're things like goal setting, feedback, action planning, modeling. And in that case, we're talking about CPD, right? So when we say modeling, we're saying a teacher educator in a CPD session modeling something to teachers. It's not referring to like teachers modeling in the classroom. It's specifically the moves that a teacher educator might make in a CPD session. The conclusions of this paper was that out of these 14, the more that are present, the greater the ultimate pupil learning. And they had a quite kind of like rigorous deep dive into this. There's a evidence summary that underpins the main paper that I really recommend people read as well. But it's great because it's really exciting for me when it first came out, and it's still as exciting to me now because it gives us, okay, here are the bits that make a PD tick. Here's how we can think about squeezing more juice, getting more power out of our PD efforts, and hopefully in a more efficient way, if we can kind of bundle lots of mechanisms in at the same time, we can create like really impactful PD that's gonna like really pack a punch and give us value for money.
You may have already touched on this, but what are some of the benefits to school or trust leaders to taking that mechanisms first approach?
Yeah, I think you're right, and I didn't make that clear, so that's a really good push. I think the risk of going for, in particular, a forms approach to PD, so labels like instructional coaching or lesson study or teacher learning communities, is that school leaders might feel the sort of the pressure or even seduced by the idea of saying, well, if we bring this thing in that's supposed to be good or great, we can replace our existing PD systems and we'll have much more impact. And there's a real risk to that, right? I mean, firstly, there's the opportunity cost of just spending lots of time having to overhaul, tear down existing structures, bring in new systems and procedures, train and develop staff on how to use and engage in those systems. So there's a lot of time involved in that. Um, there's also like a motivational and kind of buy-in impact to that. if you spent the last few years working on an existing kind of in-house PD setup, and now you're asking teachers to change tack and say, yeah, you've put lots of effort and energy into kind of understanding what we're doing and why we're doing it with our existing processes, but we now want you to sort of learn and buy into and engage in a sort of new way of working. Again, I think there's quite a lot of potential cost in terms of the time and energy you're asking of teachers there. You know, teachers who are incredibly busy. And I think on the other hand, if we think about a mechanism first approach, and again, we sort of like look at our kind of menu of 14 mechanisms, we can do something quite cool, which is teachers can look at, or school leaders can look at their existing CPD offer and say, right, we're currently doing these things to support teachers to develop on an ongoing basis. Like, which mechanisms are currently present? So you might look and think, well, currently I'm doing instruction. So we're teaching teachers some new approaches, we're sharing some new strategies with them. We're doing action planning, we're asking to plan ahead to their lessons when they're thinking about these new ideas. We're giving social support. We're setting up buddy systems, maybe. That's quite a cool one, I think, using buddies for social support, or even doing collaborative action planning, where teachers could tick that box as well. We're doing feedback, so teachers are giving each other peer feedback on their planning. And we're doing goal setting, so maybe they set themselves a little personal action plan at the end of the PD. So rather than taking that and saying, well, I'm going to replace it with lesson study, or I'm going to replace it with teacher learning communities, we might think, well, hang on, I've already got, what's that, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 mechanisms in there. Now, the literature suggests that we can avoid overhauling that completely and ripping it down and planning from scratch, but actually we could tweak and adjust our existing approaches by saying, right, which mechanisms have we got? Which mechanisms aren't present? And then think, well, how can I bring in some of my missing elements in a way that is integrated and coherent with my existing approach? So in my example, kind of at the start, I think I said that you might start with the instruction mechanism, which is you introduce a new strategy, you talk about how it works to teachers. Well, maybe after that, we want to do some modeling. So rather than just explaining a new strategy to teachers, we might want to model it to them, show them how it looks. So that could be a live model delivered by the teacher educator, or it could be showing a video of it in practice. And then you could drill down on that and start to discuss, well, what elements are here? What's the purpose of those elements? And so on and so forth. Another mechanism that's missing from the example I gave, I think, is revisiting prior learning. So you might want to start your session off by saying, right, well, everyone look back to our previous like staff meeting and think about the strategy or the step you set yourself to work on from then. Like, how's it gone? Like, what were your successes? Where were the areas that you still are kind of grappling with? And they can discuss with a kind of partner and get some kind of feedback from their partner. So I hope it kind of makes sense that you can take this approach and instead of just ripping things up and saying, well, I need to just bring in a new label or a new form, we can start to think really deeply and critically about the different elements of our PD offer in a school and like tweak and hone those by thinking really carefully about, well, what's the purpose of these? What function are they serving? What mechanisms present here? And then, of course, you can do even cooler things by saying, right, well, I'm currently doing setting goals by having teachers write a personal action plan. Can I do that setting goals mechanism with even more kind of granularity or even more nuance? Likewise, with kind of modeling, you can do really exciting things with models to, again, like squeeze loads of juice out of that limited time available.
I think it sounds really appealing to school leaders because one of the things I've noticed across many, many schools is that the only constant sometimes is change. And if you can avoid that reset, then, I think it sounds like a very valid approach, and one that, with like you say, with a big investment of time, maybe it's a very difficult thinking session that you go through, maybe a couple of hours with your, I don't know, senior leaders or those leaders who are going to be driving the change forward. You can then get bigger gains as you go through. So, as a former school leader, I'm thinking, yes, this avoids having to establish why we should do this new thing, which is quite often one of the most difficult things you can do as a leader.
And I think teachers get initiative fatigue, right? They're tired a lot of the time of every year in September, a brand new initiative being introduced, whether that's about teaching, learning, or staff development. And they think, hang on, what about the thing we introduced last September? Can we not finish doing that or get better at doing that? And old initiatives sometimes, unfortunately kind of get slowly kind of phased out and we stop talking about them or they get kind of swept under the rug. And so I think ultimately it's a question of how do we um uh think about how we deliver our in-house PD, which again I think is my push, is there's huge benefits for doing in-house PD, but there are significant limitations upon the time teachers have to engage in that over the course of a working week. There's so much teachers have to do. So how can we do it really efficiently? And I suppose at this point it's worth mentioning one of my bugbears is when talking about the ES mechanisms is there's a kind of assumption that each mechanism has like a one-to-one interaction with an input of PD. So first I'm going to start my session off by doing my instruction mechanism. Then I'm going to do my modeling. Then I'm going to do my action planning. And I think actually the most effective PD offers have at any one given time, any one given section of a PD session, have got multiple mechanisms happening at the same time, uh, which again gives you great efficiency, even more power in terms of potential impact. And you can speak to that efficiency question, which of course is really present in the minds of senior leaders with that limited time available for staff development for those kind of staff meetings or CPD sessions.
I mean, knowing how we enjoy compartmentalizing our lessons into different sections, I can see how that's a natural place to go. And it almost, whenever I was listening to your talk, I was thinking about, right, okay, in the right hands, this can be a really effective approach. Certainly the EF and the mechanisms and the sort of the smarter way to think about professional development. But there also felt like there was this opportunity for mutation, and that's almost seems like one of the first signs of it. But then what I thought you did really well is you explored some of the different mechanisms in depth, and I thought it'd be great to share that with others. So one of them, as you've already mentioned, is goal setting. What might that look like on the ground if we were trying to take this really sensible approach to our PD?
Yeah, I think goal setting is a good example of one where there's a real risk of mutation. And I've seen this firsthand um, in a range of contexts in schools and trusts around the country. And I think it's important to say that, these the risk of mistranslation or examples of mistranslation is not to blame teachers or school leaders. I think it's again like super, super challenging to take some potentially quite abstract theoretical ideas and translate them into practice in a way that's highly effective. So I think it's like unsurprising and also certainly not the fault or of teachers and school leaders to maybe sometimes miss the mark on how we get these things right. But I think it's important to call out some of those potential lethal mutations so we can try to avoid them. Like, I think it's worth going back to what the theory says. So the theory about goal setting, and if you go and read the systematic review that underpins the EEF's um, guidance report on effective professional development, it links back to kind of a range of research that talks about these purposes of goal setting. So we're trying to direct teachers' attention towards some desirable new practices. We're helping teachers to attend to and track their successes. So straight away, for the maybe a canny listener who's aware of the 14 mechanisms, straight away we're not just doing setting goals. We're doing like self-monitoring because teachers can track their successes. We're doing managing cognitive load by directing their attention. So just an example there of how we've got multiple mechanisms happening at the same time straight away. But back to setting goals. And the last part about setting goals, I think, is it can help teachers build autonomy, right? Feelings of autonomy, because if they're involved in co-constructing or setting their own goals, that can help teachers feel motivated and bought into PD. One of the risks I've seen of these lethal mutation in practice of this goal setting is thinking, right, well, what we're going to do is goal setting is a great mechanism and it's really important for PD. That's what EF say. We're going to link teachers' engagement in professional development to their appraisal and their pay progression. So it might be something like if you're doing instructional coaching, you say, well, progress in instructional coaching, making satisfactory progress in instructional coaching is kind of a core performance management target for all teachers. Now, I'm sure I'd have to explain this to you, Kieran, but like to me, that fundamentally misses the mark on like what you might mean by setting like really powerful goals. Like, firstly, there's like for me the framing kind of characteristic of great professional development is that it should be developmental, not evaluative. Its role isn't to evaluate how good teachers are at their jobs. Its goal is to help teachers develop and improve and get better. And just like in teaching, if you have formative approaches to assessment, those are really good at helping pupils get better, but they're really not very well tuned to like ranking students or saying how effective they are. And the risk of, approach like this, like linking progress in coaching or linking progress in PD to appraisal or even, pay progression, like I think ultimately undermines teachers' motivation rather than building it to engage in ongoing development work. Because it makes PD high stakes all of a sudden. And fundamentally, for a developmental approach to PD, we want to be low stakes as possible. It's about supporting teachers to get better and to be really open, honest, and vulnerable in their practice. A fine version of goal setting would be to say, well, let's not do that. Let's just help teachers set really kind of clear, concrete, actionable targets for the changes they can make in their practice. You might have set them smart targets, and so on and so forth. So saying, right, after this PD session, I'm going to go and try out um, using a technique like show call, for example, which some people call spotlight, which is sort of selecting a piece of students' work to highlight in front of the class to kind of celebrate successes and potentially talk about areas that are common areas amongst the group. Great. They've set themselves a goal. But I think there's more interesting ways of goal setting. And I spoke earlier on about how we can potentially be more nuanced with these mechanisms. So going beyond just kind of setting smart targets, I'm a huge fan of the work of Mary Kennedy. Anyone who knows me know that I'll happily talk about her all day. And she wrote two absolutely seminal papers in 2016. So one was called Passing the Practice of Teaching, and one was called How Does Professional Development Improve Teaching? And in these kind of papers, she sets out a perspective on PD and teacher learning, which is that teachers really are thinking about their own goals in the classroom or the problems they're grappling with regarding kind of the learning of children. They're fundamentally problem solvers, is what Kennedy says. They're looking to solve problems sort of minute by minute in the classroom to help young people develop kind of personally and academically. And one implication of this is that we should focus not on kind of initially, at least, on strategies or techniques, but instead upon the purposes of different approaches and the problems teachers might want to solve in the classroom. So why and when teachers might use certain strategies to solve particular challenges in the classroom. And so from this, I think it gives us like a much more or a new layer of doing goal setting. So rather than settling on and stopping at just setting some smart targets for an action step for a teacher for a week, instead I'd start earlier. I start kind of higher up the waterfall of thinking and say, well, firstly, we want to think about what are your goals in the classroom? What are the specific challenges you're grappling with day in, day out when it comes to the learning of children? Kennedy gives 5 of these. She calls them persistent problems. So there's portraying the curriculum, exposing student thinking, enlisting student participation, containing student behavior. That's interesting language on that one, but that's what she calls it. And accommodating teachers' own personal needs. I would argue that the grain size of those is far too coarse and they're really, really big and expansive. And actually, for me, what I would uh, do myself when I'm working with teachers or coaching is set much more specific classroom challenges that are kind of unique to that teacher. So something that a teacher might tell you, you say, well, like what things you want to work on? Like what's the stuff you're really grappling with? And what's funny is when you ask teachers these things, like they can tell you. I don't like the idea of a coach or a leader of PD going into a teacher's classroom and saying, here's what you're going to work on, here are your problems. That teacher's in their classroom day in, day out, with their kind of pupils face to face all day. If you drop in as a coach for 10 minutes, I'm not convinced that you're the one who's going to really pick out that overarching challenge or goal that teacher really wants to and needs to focus on. So if you ask teachers, they can give you really good answers. And they might say something like, well, you know what I find in my classroom, I'm really grappling with, and I'd love to work on this with you. Like, my kids understand new ideas when I first teach them. They seem to get it. And through checking for understanding and questioning, like we're on the same page and they answer independent questions in class and they do really well. But then a few weeks later, at like an end of unit test, they seem to have forgotten it all. Like, what's going on here? Can we work on this? That's like a really nice specific classroom challenge because it's unique to that teacher. It's either co-constructed or led on by them. And this is like I say, like a nicer way or a more powerful way of doing goal setting because this links fundamentally to purpose and to goals in the classroom. So now I could use that, let's say if I was an instructional coach um, uh, with a particular teacher, I could use that as a frame for maybe a term's worth of coaching and say, great, this is your specific classroom challenge you really want to work on. And again, that's your goal, going back to the setting goals mechanism. Like every week when we work together, every fortnight when we work together, we're going to work on things that aim to address and support and kind of circle around that particular goal. And that helps twofold, right? Firstly, me as a coach, it gives me something to focus on in the classroom when I'm watching that teacher teach, rather than looking at the infinite number of bits of information I could be kind of processing from an incredibly kind of busy and complex classroom environment. But it also means that every week the teacher's working on things that relate to something that they value and they want to work on, and that fits in with their own mental model of their classroom and the things they're trying to achieve in their classroom. So now rather than saying, okay, like we're going to introduce some interleaving, let's say, and when we do some independent practice questions in maths, we're going to mix up some questions from like this lesson and some from last lesson, perhaps. Rather than saying do interleaving, I'm saying, right, well, in order to help consolidate and strengthen children's learning from that previous topic and for the current topic as well, it has twofold benefits. Um, like we're going to like work on interleaving different types of questions in that independent practice. So it goes from being strategy first, like do this new thing, to being purpose driven, like in order to.
Makes a huge difference. And I can see how you're tying all those threads together in what is really it's a really complex example of how it might look in practice. But I think you could almost you could set out a structure for thinking through the thought process is what I mean. If we look through the stages you've gone through there, it's really clear and how a leader, in particular how a coach, might then decide to support someone and tying the mechanisms together. Now, the one thing is that are you happy for even our least experienced colleagues to decide what they need next, or is there a certain amount of guidance? I mean, it almost feels trivial, but I think there will be people who are asking themselves, do I just tell my ECTs what they need to do, or where would you draw the line?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think it depends on what you mean by least experienced. Because I think in a kind of ITE setting with a beginner teacher, there is a, uh, people might not agree on this, but I would argue there is probably like a basic um, progression of like the fundamentals of teaching and learning that we want to induct new teachers into. Um, and likewise, in the early career framework with our ECTs, there is a curriculum set out over 2 years that breaks down some of those absolute fundamentals that we kind of think are our current best bet on how we might support uh, sort of beginner teachers to work on their practice. I think there's like so I think within that framework, so to go back to the ECF, for example, within that kind of framework, you might be on the behavior strand. There is, at least in a number of providers, there's clear guidance that says to a mentor, you should be being responsive to what that early career teacher knows and can do in order to um, adapt that provision to their kind of level of knowledge or kind of skill. Um, but I think as part of that, even if you were to say, right, let's say for argument's sake, we have to work on a behavior strand this term, I'd still be really interested in speaking to that early career teacher and saying, well, look, we're working on behavior this term. It's possibly, let's say it's ECT year one, so it's a brand new school. Like, can we just discuss like your experiences of behavior in your kind of previous school, and since you've kind of started here, and the kind of things that you are finding in behavior that might be kind of barriers to learning for young people. Um, and so even if there is a kind of set curriculum that you are like more or less boxed into, depending on the level of flexibility you've got as an ECT mentor, I still think there's real power in drawing out the perspectives of an early career teacher and saying, well, you know, let's just make this more concrete rather than saying, like I said, we're going through week one behavior, we're going to do like X, Y, and Z. Let's say it's, I don't know, like least invasive interventions or self-interrupt or something like this, some sort of really concrete small strategies. Still kind of drawing out from that teacher like how these things might link to their practice, the kind of challenges they're facing in context, and then that gives again more power to those mentor meetings, so we can link back something that might become quite overtly surface feature driven or strategy driven. Like, here's the new techniques to do this week. Let's go and do it. And pull it back to being like, okay, here's your purpose in the classroom, where here's the thing you're trying to achieve in the classroom, here are your goals. And then there can be a really clear discussion about how that links to achieving those things, which the mentor might have to lead on quite carefully in sense that whilst that um, early career teacher might have a really clear idea of the things they're grappling with, they might not be able to draw the links really kind of explicitly or with really kind of great skill between how a given week's approach might link to that challenge. But I think the reason why I think, in answer to your question as well, like we still should maybe ask an early career teacher or even an ITE candidate um, those things they're grappling with. It is again going back to my point as a kind of mentor or as a leader of PD or as a scene leader or a phase leader. I'd pop into somebody's classroom for I could watch a whole lesson, I could watch 10 minutes. But either way, they're in that classroom at the chalk face day in, day out. Um, I think there's huge validity and like kind of just professional respect in saying, like, you know the things that happen in your classroom better than me. Now, I might need to uh, work with that teacher to try to clarify precisely the details of those challenges. If they said, for example, my pupils aren't very engaged, I'd say, right, I don't know what that means. That could mean 100 different things. Um, like, let's try and drill down precisely what you mean by that. I mean, is it the fact that pupils aren't, for example, raising their hands to ask questions independently? Is it that they're not answering questions? Is it that they are doodling or messing around whilst you're giving an explanation? Is it they're slow to start independent work? You know, all of these things are completely different challenges, but might be boxed under that kind of quite vague idea of people engagement. So there might be a process of that co-construction of trying to really draw out of that teacher what it is they really want to work on. But I think that's a hugely valuable piece in that kind of making PD purposeful. And it isn't just about buying the motivation, and it's fundamentally about building a teacher's mental models about their practice, how they think about what they do and why they do it and for what purpose, rather than giving them a box of tricks and saying, you know, going kind of indiscriminately kind of tick off like a checklist, a bunch of kind of like disconnected and meaningless teaching strategies or meaningless to them.
Autonomy is something that I wrestle with on a number of levels. And so I thought you'd done such a good job of explaining what the effective sort of pulling of the goal setting lever or mechanism might be that I thought, well, actually, I'm going to ask Nick to see if I can build on my own autonomy mental model. But also, I think a lot of school leaders listen, and I think they'll be interested in that in the actual, what might this mean for my decision making. Another of the, I mean, this one might be a bit of a loaded question. Another one of the EF's mechanisms is rehearsal. Teacher rehearsal, deliberate practice are quite popular at the moment. Is there a chance that this has already begun to mutate? And can a mechanisms first approach help prevent such mutations?
This is a very emotive topic in the sector. As you know, Kieran, you've handed me a loaded grenade there, but I'll do my best to dance around it. whilst giving, I think, a really clear idea of what I think about this. I'll start with a brief caveat. I don't like the term deliberate practice, and I wrote recently a series of three blog posts spanning 3,500 words to explain why I don't like the term, which potentially at the end of it felt like potentially about necessary. But it was a useful intellectual exercise. And I can sum it up in a minute, which might speak to the waste of all those words. But in summary, in school you have once again the jingle fallacy. So people using deliberate practice as a kind of wrapper or as a term to describe often wildly differing approaches in practice. So in that sense, we're not even talking about the same thing in the sector when we say deliberate practice. We can't even compare opinions because we're often talking about different things. The other is that if you look back to the literature, Anders Ericsson originally kind of developed the term and it's spread rapidly across teaching in the last 10, 15 years. Like often and almost in all cases, what's happening in schools like bears very little resemblance to Anders Ericsson's actual definition of deliberate practice from the literature. I think that's fine, and I think that's an okay thing because I think teaching is a fairly unique expertise development domain, and so we should do things differently. But I think it's worth caveating that I think for both those reasons, I don't think saying deliberate practice is very useful. I also am increasingly trying not to use the word rehearsal, which is funny because it's one of the EF's mechanisms. It's what they call one of the 14. I think my issue with potentially using rehearsal is that it implies that all low stakes practice is about standing up and doing something. So, like practicing how to set up a really effective turn and talk with children. So you'd practice how to give clear instructions, maybe how to like model what a good turn and talk looks like, and how to set people's off on it. And a lot of I think of people's mental models of rehearsal or deliberate practice are about people standing up and doing something. But I think that ignores the other half of things we practice, and we might want to also practice the products of teaching, the things we want to plan in terms of our curriculum, preparing lesson elements, how to design a really good hinge question, how to design like a really good image for the board that's going to show a really complex concept and the links between aspects of that image, right? Sitting down with the teacher and practicing doing some planning is still practicing. So as a result, I've really moved to just trying to say kind of low stakes planning and practice rather than talking about deliberate practice or kind of rehearsal. But your question was about these lethal mutations, and I think the root of these lethal mutations, as far as I've kind of thought about it, is that there's a often unconscious assumption that teacher development is about behavior change. And I think this comes back to Mary Kennedy again. If we design and lead PD from a strategy first perspective, we are essentially saying the purpose of PD is to make you do new things. Here's a list of strategies or techniques, go and do them in the classroom. Sometimes teacher educators talk about the knowing doing gap, and that refers to this idea that teachers learn and understand the new practice in the PD session or the staff meeting, but they fail to translate that into their classroom. And the knowing doing gap, often again, if we talk about it as a core aspect or a core challenge of PD, leads to this idea we should go and make teachers do something different. We need to work at ways of making them change their behavior better. The risk that Mary Kennedy says about this is that if we approach PD from a strategy first perspective, we risk teachers using the wrong techniques at the wrong times for the wrong reasons. And accountability structures can make this worse, right? If after your PD session that basically says, go and do this new technique, you then go round as a very kind of conscientious senior leader and think, right, I'm going to go and check that teachers are doing the new technique that I've rolled out. You wander into a classroom and it becomes this binary accountability question. Are they doing the new thing or are they not? And often you get an effect which I call speed cameraing, which is teachers slam the brakes on their lesson and suddenly start doing a new technique. That'd be halfway through an explanation. You walk into the classroom and they think, golly, Monday staff meeting, we did turn and talk. A phase leader's in here. Right, kids, we're going to do a turn and talk now. And suddenly at a completely inappropriate point of a lesson, teachers start doing turn and talk because of this kind of strategy first, behavior change, accountability system. So ultimately, I think the purpose of PD isn't to make teachers do new things. That might be a product of it, but it isn't really our goal. Our goal is to develop teachers' mental models, the things they know about highly effective teaching, the things they know about pupil learning, so that they can then make really high quality decisions in the classroom about what to do or what not to do when faced with a given scenario or a given challenge. Like that's teacher expertise. Great teachers aren't going through teaching a champion and just ticking off strategies one at a time. They're thinking often quite unconsciously because when you get very expert, it becomes almost intuitive, right? But they're thinking very unconsciously about their class, very on a very purpose-driven level about their classroom, on a goal level, um, about how to solve and challenges, and like I said, kind of teachers are problem solvers. So, like to me, there's a risk that deliberate practice or rehearsal, or how I like to call it, kind of just low stakes planning and practice, gets used as a behavior change lever. And so you end up with potentially a session where you say, right, here's the new technique. I'm going to show you what it looks like. So for the modeling, great, that ticks a mechanism. I'm going to break it down with some success criteria, which is nice because that manages cognitive load, directing attention. That's another mechanism. But then we say, right, now you're just going to practice it and get feedback from a partner about how good your practice was. Stand up, have a practice, get some feedback against success criteria, have another go. Great. Go into your classroom and do it. I think we can do cooler stuff than that. I think we can do more meaningful aspects of deliberate practice or rehearsal or low stakes practice um, that are more faithful to what we like. I think when we think about it, we really mean by expertise in teaching. Um, shall I talk through like what that might look like?
Yeah, I think that'd be fantastic.
So I think ultimately, like if our aim is to build teachers' mental models, we can use this low stakes practice to help teachers to understand like how a new approach works, which is key for their mental models, to build their confidence in doing it. There's a very small element that's building kind of some kind of automaticity or habit change or fluency, but I think that's often overstated. I think doing a 10-minute practice in a PD session or a coaching meeting probably isn't going to build automaticity or fluency. That's going to probably come over time. That habit change piece will come over time. But ultimately, I think having this space for troubleshooting, collaboration, reflection, and revision can help build the way teachers think about the decisions they make in the classroom, about different approaches, the purposes those approaches serve, and the potential impacts upon pupils of those things. So, like, if we're thinking about uh, this, we're talking about what I might call adaptive expertise. I'm drawing on the literature. Hatano and Aurora write about this quite a bit. And they distinguish between routine expertise, which are the more habit driven aspects of teachers' practices, and more adaptive expertise. So again, it's adaptive expertise, not adaptive teaching. So it's not to do with that whole adaptive teaching piece. It's adaptive expertise. The name potentially is a bit, unfortunately, has some crossover, but isn't the same thing. Adaptive expertise is the ability of teachers to make decisions in the moment, to respond in an adaptive and responsive way to some of those more contingent aspects of teaching, some of the more unpredictable elements of the classroom. And a huge amount of teaching is that, right? Like running a classroom discussion without potentially like a clear outcome or something that students have to do by the end of it. So the question for me is, well, how can we get teachers to think really hard about their decision making to build some of that more adaptive expertise through rehearsal? And I think we can do some interesting stuff. Like if the question is how to hone in on those decisions and their consequences, we can then pick out points before, during, and after practice to get teachers not just to think about doing a new strategy or technique, but the decisions and the trade-offs, the purposes and the impacts of those things. So an example that I often like to give is the risk of when you ask people a question and they say, I don't know, there are some options here, right? So if a pupil says, I don't know in response to your question, you could push them and say, like, no, like I think you do know this. Like, I want you to try a bit harder. Option two is you could give them a cue or some kind of scaffold or some hint to fill in the gaps. Or you could bounce to another pupil, get that pupil to answer the question, and then typically in this approach, you bounce back to the first pupil and ask them to repeat back the answer just so they've had the chance to say it and that you're confident that they've heard it and hopefully it's going to start building their knowledge. The decision about which of those three, and I've simplified this, right? But we have to simplify these things to focus on these conversations with teachers. Um, Thinking about those three, the decision about which of those to do is going to be hugely contextual based upon the young person in front of you. So if you think the person answering is actually a really kind of quite confident and maybe high prioritizing people who you think probably does know the answer, but maybe they're not putting their all their effort in today and they're giving you kind of 50% or less, and they're just saying, I don't know. They're trying to opt out of learning. And your expectation in your classroom, which you've shared with your pupils beforehand, is, we expect everyone to give 100% and we want to think as hard as we can and you want to do yourself justice. You might, in that setting, in that scenario, go back to that pupil and push them and say, no, no, I think you could, like, I want you to think really hard. I'll give you a minute to think really hard and come back to me with an answer. Like, if you think a pupil, like, is potentially a bit, like, less confident with the answer and less competent in that topic, but you think they're almost there, and you think that pushing them is going to potentially be of benefit with a small hint or a cue, you might go back to them with a hint or a cue. And if you think, well, actually, if people say, I don't know, and my hunch is, because I know my pupils very well, they generally don't know it, and it's going to be quite unproductive for their self-esteem and their feeling as a learner in the classroom to kind of push them, I might bounce to other people and then come back to them. Those are the three options. We can then play with that in rehearsal, in our low stakes practice. We could say, right, like let out these three options with a teacher for these strategies and say, right, well, let's explore these. We start a low stakes practice, so the teacher might jump up and start doing some questioning, and the teacher educator or a peer would be kind of acting as the kind of pupil. On this, I don't really like role play. And so typically what I would do is I wouldn't have the person who's sitting down as the pupil actually give any kind of answer. I would just have them say answer, rather than having to kind of get into some kind of silly role play situation. In this case, I think it's fine for them to say, I don't know, because it's very short and there's no complexity involved. But often when I coach, I have teachers coach and practice, sorry, and I'm sitting down in the role of pupil, and I'll just say answer rather than kind of pretending that I've given a real answer. But in this case, I think it's okay to say I don't know. So the coach or the teacher educator or the peer sits down and says, I don't know. And then we could say pause. So pause points are really powerful. We say pause, right? What are the options here? Which student are you imagining in front of you from your class? Tell me about them. Tell me about their profile as a learner. What do you think is going to be the best option for you to take with this particular pupil, and why? What will be the impact on them? Okay, what are the trade-offs? Fine. Okay, let's restart the practice. Let's maybe rewind and just ask the question again, and then we're going to run through it. And potentially it's a bounce, potentially it's a kind of push with a cue. So we put pause points in at these kind of critical decision-making moments. The benefit is that it can help teachers to think hard about the decisions and the trade-offs involved and the purpose and the impact upon pupils. But also, if in that moment the teacher might not be sharing or getting right to the nub of the most important ideas there, the teacher educator can then like fill in some of those gaps and use it to expose some of their own expert mental models and their own expert knowledge from the classroom. Because fundamentally, one of the problems here is that a lot of those decisions that expert teachers make are hidden. They're inside their heads. You can't see them out loud. So it's exposing those through that kind of discussion. You can also then, after that kind of practice session, have a debrief, a kind of a feedback session where you talk about, well, like to what extent do you think we've successfully kind of addressed that original problem we were grappling with in kind of dialogue with a teacher? Like what would the impact of certain moves? What would the impact of certain decisions? What would the impact be on on the children in class? That's one way I think we can start to build some of that adaptive decision making through uh, through our kind of low stakes planning and practice sessions.
I think it's brilliant. It really illuminates the options that teachers and school leaders have, because that's often the bit, we talk about this hot potato or this grenade that's flying about there. It's often the bit that's missed, I think, sometimes. And so what you've done is sort of almost outline your rationale, but equally, here's what you might do to effectively utilize rehearsals. So I think fantastic. And I could definitely listen to you talk about this stuff all day. I mean, have you thought about your own podcast or radio show? I reckon Radio 4 would snap you up, Nick.
I need to find the time, Kieran. That's the problem. There's a book somewhere in the works on some of this stuff, but again, it's the time. So once I can, yeah, find some time to put this together, maybe there'll be something in print that kind of puts this together. But for the moment, yeah, unfortunately, it's all just stuck up here or in my blog, you know. But even the blog, it's hard to keep a constant output.
Yeah, I mean that would be fantastic. I mean the last three blogs, those three blogs were I think they got decent traction. I mean it's hard to tell in a time of difficult visibility online, but they're certainly worth a read if anyone hasn't checked them out. In fact, what I'll do is I'll link them in the sort of description of this episode. So I think we've probably just about got time to almost summarize and really think about what you think the most important and or actionable elements of teacher professional development might be. What would you say in your opinion?
So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to talk about mechanisms because I've talked about those for the entire conversation so far. So I'm going to take that as read that I think, hopefully it's been clear by now. I think they're pretty important. I think there are like three elements that are absolutely critical in my eyes to a really coherent, really impactful in-house PD offer for teacher learning within a school or within a trust. I think the first is a shared language for what excellent, effective, transformational teaching and learning looks like. Any of the bits I've talked about today, building a mechanism rich approach to teacher development, bringing instructional coaching, whatever it may be, is toothless without having a really high level of agreement and understanding within a staff body about what great looks like when it comes to teaching and learning approaches. Because ultimately, you could say, well, Nick, I'm going to bring in instructional coaching into my school. And I say, great, but what are you coaching them on? And it's not sufficient for those who are in a teacher development lead position to have all that stuff in their heads, because it also has to be in teachers' heads. They have to have an understanding of the things you're talking about, whether that's the underpinning theoretical insights that underpin strategies or the strategies and techniques themselves. And of course, it won't be a surprise for me to say that it's not just about having the strategy and techniques, but it's the purposes of those and why we might use those. So that's the first one, I think, a really clear shared understanding of what excellence in teaching looks like in this setting. The second one is culture. So I think once again, you can bring in the most transformationally designed PD offer into a school or setting. But if there isn't a culture in the school where teachers feel and believe that professional development is inherently about developing people in a low stakes way, and that it's about getting better every single day, because that's our, like I've said, I think our moral duty to the young people we work with, then like once again, the risk is that that PD offer fails. Um, this is a really hard one because teachers are in a landscape where they've got historically um, lots of high stakes accountability processes in schools. You know, graded observations, observations that feed into appraisals, or maybe even pay progression. The idea of somebody like wanting to really drill down on and interrogate your practice for a solely developmental purpose in a low stakes way is quite a hard shift away for many teachers from like previous systems that were more high stakes and more accountability kind of focused. So I don't think it's an overnight change that can be made. I also don't think you can just tell teachers, oh, this is now developmental. It's now non-judgmental. It's now low stakes. None of this feeds into your appraisal. We just want to help you improve and get better. We're not interested in judging how good of a teacher you are. You can say that to somebody, but helping to believe it, I think, is a much slower process. And ultimately, I think a lot of that comes through show, don't tell. Well, probably tell, but showing is the biggest part. Showing teachers that actually, when they start to see that your work in PD isn't feeding into appraisal, when they see that people aren't being judged or graded or compared, when it comes to in-house PD offers, when they see that everyone is open to and is entitled to and is expected to engage in PD, not just beginner teachers or early career teachers or teachers who are perceived as being struggling or might be on kind of capability plans, but everyone from phase leaders to senior leadership team to the kind of head, everyone's there focusing on their practice and what they do and trying to get better. And for example, one thing that some schools do to help support this is have the action step that each teacher's working on each week, kind of on a piece of card outside their door. So you walk around the school and you see every single teacher in the school is working on getting better, and that's what we do. That's what we do here is we work on ourselves professionally because that's part of our professional duty. But I think that is a tough one, and it's a slow process that you have to be quite intentional about building and being really careful about not undermining it through kind of missteps that might be perceived as being overly accountability focused. The third part is developing teacher educators. So I mentioned right at the start that I think there's this potentially missed trick that we've had for years, which is not recognizing that there is a body of knowledge and skill to being a great leader of teacher development. And again, that's everybody from a mentor to a department lead to a phase lead to the ECF lead to a assistant head teacher or deputy head teacher or the head. Anyone who's in any way involved in helping other teachers get better is a teacher educator. And something I think is absolutely fundamental to the long-term impact and sustainability of any of these approaches is thinking really hard about our offer in-house for helping those teacher educators and those leaders and those mentors to get better in what they do, helping to build their knowledge of effective teaching and learning, their knowledge of effective PD, their knowledge of implementing these things in a really coherent and acceptable way. So alongside your kind of teacher learning curriculum and your teacher learning offer, I think we want to think really hard about, well, what's the offer? What's the learning curriculum for teacher educators that sits alongside that?
You've definitely got a book. It better come out soon. I'm going to have to put a warning at the start of this episode that anyone who normally runs should bring a pen and pencil with them as they go on their Sunday jog. I think that's really powerful. I think this is going to be an immensely useful multiple listen episode. All I have to do is say thank you very much for joining me, Nick. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Kieran. It's been a pleasure.
And to everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.